So what's it like to buy your first cryptocurrency on Kraken? Well, let's say I'm at a food truck I've never tried before. Am I gonna go all in on the loaded taco? No, sir. I'm keeping it simple, starting small. That's trading on Kraken. Pick from over 190 assets and start with the $10 in your pocket. Easy. Go to Kraken.com and see what crypto can be. Not investment advice. Crypto trading involves risk of loss. Cryptocurrency services are provided to U.S. and U.S. territory customers by Payward Interactive Inc., PWI, DBA Kraken. View PWI's disclosures at kraken.com/legal/disclosures.
When your destination is discovery, there are no wrong turns. That's why, at its very core, the new 2025 Lincoln Aviator SUV provides momentum beyond mere transportation. In this thoughtfully crafted and confidence-inspiring SUV, your destination is not about where you can go, but who you can be. Explore more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Aviator trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Rebecca Glazer, a professor in the School of Public Affairs at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. Professor Glazer is the director of the Little Rock Congregation Study and the author of the book Faith and Community, How Engagement Strengthens Members, Places of Worship, and Society, which we'll be discussing today. Rebecca Glazer, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm happy to be here.
So I thought we'd start with the most basic, the most obvious question is, what were you setting out to investigate in this book? And also, since we're both political scientists, what sort of data, maybe what sort of methods did you use to try to get at some answers there?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. Well, like any good academic research study, our questions definitely changed over time. So we started back in 2012, and I'll definitely use the plural when I'm talking about this study because although my name is on the cover of the book, over 200 student researchers contributed to this project. So it was a collective effort for sure. And when we started in 2012, we really wanted to know about how religion was influencing political choices. And so we surveyed and interviewed and conducted focus groups with congregation leaders and with members of congregations. We started with 5 congregations in 2012. And we asked about political participation, we asked about community engagement, and we also asked overtly partisan questions about vote choice. And what we learned that year was a bunch of interesting things about how religion was influencing political choices. But we also learned that people didn't love answering overtly partisan questions at their place of worship. So we engaged a clergy advisory board, and we started focusing more on community-based questions because this really turned into a very community-based research project. And we wanted to engage our congregations and their members as real partners in this project. And we wanted to return results to them that mattered to them. So we continued in 2016, in 2018, 2019, and 2020, collecting more data, more surveys, interviews, focus groups, and doing in-depth case studies as well. So this is truly a multi-method, long-term research project. To understand the big question we ended up answering is about the impact of community engagement on congregations, on their members, and on the broader society.
So before we get into your findings, I want to ask the question some people are thinking about as well. How generalizable, or what's the external validity here for a study on Little Rock? To what extent do you think that what you found, which we'll get to in a minute, is applicable to places outside of Little Rock?
Yeah, that's such a great question because there's a lot that is unique about Little Rock. The religiosity of the city, the historical racial divisions in the city, the poverty. But we think there's a lot about our findings that apply beyond just Little Rock. So the problems that congregations are facing with declining attendance, with aging populations, aging membership, with fewer and fewer young people being engaged, the problems that they're facing post-COVID, all of these are issues that congregations all across the United States are facing. And we think that the way that community engagement can really benefit individual members of congregations, as well as the places of worship themselves, and the way that those aggregate up to societies as a whole, that a lot of that has to do with just religious humans and the way that congregations work, and that's not specific to Little Rock.
I want to talk a little bit about what we mean or what you mean by engagement, because when I hear the term religious engagement or congregation engagement, I get this image in my head of largely black churches in, say, the 1950s to 1960s, civil rights movement sort of stuff, protests and marches and those sort of things. And I know that's certainly got to be part of it, but there's a lot more to engagement than that, right?
Absolutely. Those are great examples that I think are in a lot of our heads of congregations really being active and out there and at the forefront of kind of political community engagement. And a lot of that is still happening. But congregations are really engaged in their community in diverse ways every single day. And that can be everything from hosting food pantries to help people who are hungry in their communities, to adopting a local elementary school to help kids learn how to read, or participating in neighborhood cleanups, to things as simple as individual people checking in on their elderly neighbors and making sure that they're okay, or taking them a meal. There are all kinds of ways that people are engaging in their communities every day, and a lot of congregations really center that as part of their religious ethos.
And so while some of it is pretty clearly political, some of it, and some of those examples you gave, are pretty clearly, at least to me, feel sort of apolitical. And since this is, of course, a politics podcast, I want to focus on the political aspects. Especially, there's one finding, I believe, that engagement, more of this religious engagement, actually helps to increase political efficacy. Now, some listeners might not be familiar with that term, so maybe we could start with you explaining what political efficacy is and how it's sort of linked to this engagement and why this is an important thing.
Absolutely. This is one of the findings that I think is so important for society and for democracy. So political efficacy is a concept that matters a lot to political scientists. Basically, it means that people believe that their voice matters and that they can make a difference. And this can really boost how democracy works and democracy running smoothly. Because if you have a society where people feel disengaged and disempowered and like their voice doesn't matter and that they can't make a difference, then they're less likely to participate. They're less likely to go out and vote. They're not going to show up to their local city council meetings. They're not going to sign petitions. They're not going to want to participate. And so when people might be feeling disillusioned and checked out, they're not going to be contributing to democracy. However, when people are part of, say, a congregation that's engaged in the community, or when they feel like they are contributing to the community, they feel a greater sense of political efficacy. They feel like their voice matters. They feel like they can make a difference. And when they have those feelings, our democracy runs more smoothly, more people are participating, and the entire system is better off. So when you're saying that some of the ways that congregations are engaging and individual people are engaging, some of them are more overtly political, but I would say that all of those ways have political consequences, because even when people are doing things that are more simple or less political, like engaging their local elementary school or helping share food or picking up litter, those things are still political because they're helping people stay connected to their community and feel that increased political efficacy. And that's making them feel a greater sense of connection to their broader society and to democracy. So that is good for our society and democracy in a way that we might not make that direct connection, but it's really helping our democracy run more smoothly.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an important point. Though obviously some of these issues, social justice things, inequality, immigration, they are incredibly politically charged. And so I'm wondering how congregations sort of work through that, because, well, I guess I wonder in one sense if there's even any kind of a tension here Do they care about politicizing themselves, or is it just something like, well, no, this is a liberal congregation or a conservative congregation? What's your sense of the dynamic at play here?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are a lot of people, just as I was saying at the beginning, who don't want those overt partisan politics in their places of worship. Now, there are a few, and I would say it's in the minority, even in a place like Arkansas, which is a very red state. But there are some congregations which are overtly political, where it's very clear that this is Republican congregation or this is a Democratic congregation. You're going to hear political sermons fairly often, but those congregations really are in the minority. Most people don't want to be hearing about politics. They're coming to their place of worship in order to be fed spiritually. So aside from those kind of outliers that are overtly political, most people don't want to be talking about politics when they come to a place of worship. And so most religious leaders are trying to stay away from that tension that can come, especially if they have a mixed congregation where there are people from different political identities attending the same congregation. And so they want to do their best to avoid appearing partisan. So what I have found in talking with congregation leaders in doing these in-depth interviews and these case studies is that sometimes they try to stay away from community engagement altogether. They might be afraid of even picking a community issue for the fear that it might be seen as partisan. But I've also found that religious leaders have a lot of power in framing the issues. So take, for instance, the issue of helping people who are unhoused, who don't have anywhere to live, who are homeless. In Little Rock, we have a pretty significant unhoused population. And that can be seen as a political issue, trying to give aid to those people. But it also can be seen as a religious issue. You could find scriptures and sacred texts about helping people in need, for instance. And the religious leader can choose which way to go there. They can frame it as a religious issue and call on their congregation to help those in need, to help those who are hungry, to help those who are unhoused, to help those who don't have enough clothing, and to rally their congregation around it as a religious call to give that aid where it's needed. Or they can let it become a political issue and add that divisiveness to the congregation. Because we really found that people trust their religious leaders and they'll answer those calls when they're made by their religious leaders.
And so I guess we talk about political capital in terms of, politicians, but there's this sort of moral capital, I guess, or moral authority that these leaders of these congregations have. And I guess it's got to be difficult for them to figure out exactly how much of it to exert, especially if we're, say, talking about, a fairly contested area politically. And if you're a leader in a congregation and you feel like you might be able to help put what you see as the side of right, moral, right over the top, but yet you might alienate some of your congregation, that's got to be pretty difficult for them to deal with, I would imagine, at times.
Absolutely. And we see that in the data that congregation leaders are saying that it's difficult to lead their congregation in these politically divisive times. And in previous research in the literature, we see congregation leaders saying that they're worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about losing donations to their congregation. They're worried about their membership being upset with them if they take a stand on political issues. Now, the key argument that we're making in the book is that what they should be doing in order to help their congregation and what we see really benefiting their membership, creating a warmer congregational culture, leading to higher attendance, greater giving, more people connecting and feeling that strong feeling of my church is my family, those warm feelings towards the congregation. That comes when the congregation is out in the community, serving, being engaged, having those connections of giving back outside of the congregation. So it doesn't happen when you give very partisan, fiery sermons, but it does happen when you connect your people with one another and go out into the community to try to give back and give service. Now, you can do that on issues that might feel like potential political issues, like immigration, like homelessness, like drug addiction. You can do it on those issues, but the key is really for the religious leaders to frame those as religious issues instead of as political issues. That's how you unite your congregation and get those benefits of community engagement instead of the divisiveness of politics.
I have this feeling that in the past, the 50s and 60s, again, I go back to the civil rights movement, that it used to be that congregations, that religious groups had maybe more of a left of center social justice, race issue sort of focus. And it feels to me like it's shifted. And now with things like, first it was same-sex marriage, now it's definitely transgender, LGBTQ plus sort of issues, and obviously abortion, that it feels like it's shifted much more over to the right. And I'm wondering what you found. Is there more of a move to the political right on some of these issues that religious organizations are getting involved in, or maybe not so much?
Yeah, I do think that there's some interesting things happening in terms of the connection between partisanship and religion. I think there's a clear affiliation with religion and the Republican Party in American politics today, where people, when they think of religion and politics, they think of the Republican Party and they think of those more right-wing issues. However, there are lots of more left-leaning religious people who are active in politics. I think that one thing that kind of hides that activity is that they're involved in a greater variety of issues, whereas people on the religious right tend to pick those kind of culture wars issues and are very vocal on those issues alone. The other thing I think that kind of hides that is that when you think of the left side on the culture wars issues on, for instance, transgender and LGBTQ plus issues and abortion, there are lots of non-religious people on the left who are speaking up about those issues, but you don't see a lot of non-religious people on the right. So it's only identified with religious people on the right, whereas there's atheists and agnostics and, religious nuns, people who don't identify with any religion, as well as more left-leaning, mainline Protestant or, Unitarian Universalists or progressive Jewish people who are all affiliated with those issues on the left. So that diversity of issues and the diversity of religious and non-religious people on the left make it less strongly associated with religion than on the right, where it's all religious people who are it's only religious people who are advocating for those issues. Not only, but mostly. And I think those are the things that are kind of hiding the diversity of religious involvement on the left.
Do you get a sense that there are any differences between how congregations that are maybe more liberal, like when I think of Unitarians, for instance, I think like way out there, far left progressive, as opposed to some congregations that just naturally, from whatever they might happen to be, their faith tends to be much more conservative. Do they approach these issues in a different sort of way, like use different tactics, or maybe more or less aggressive, or not so much?
Yeah, we have some great in-depth community case studies in the book where we look at 7 different congregations across the city of Little Rock and really look at how they're doing engagement. And what we really found is that most congregations are engaging with the community, but they're doing it in different ways. So for instance, there's a small Methodist congregation right in the heart of the city that has really built their entire ministry around helping the unhoused. There's also a Baptist congregation that's a more progressive Baptist congregation that ever since the desegregation crisis, and even before that in Little Rock, has really focused on racial justice issues. And it's a majority white congregation. And so that's a really unique congregation in our city to be focused on racial justice as a majority white congregation for, more than 60 years. And then we have a Church of Christ congregation that is really focused on relationship building. So this congregation is located in an area where over time, the neighborhood around it has changed. And so most of its members are driving from 10 plus miles away in to attend there instead of coming from the neighborhood right around it. But they're really focused on, as a more conservative evangelical congregation, building relationships with the people around them in those neighborhoods. And they've kind of adopted the zip code around them. And they go out to the park on the first Saturday of every month. They visit the people in the neighborhoods. They take meals to the elderly people. They help them change their light bulbs. They clean up litter. They play games with the kids. So it's really about building relationships. And I think that that's very much rooted in their evangelical theology. And I think for the Progressive Baptist Church, their focus on racial justice is very much rooted in their theology. So the theological orientation of the different congregations determines the ways that they're engaging with the community.
When your destination is discovery, there are no wrong turns. That's why, at its very core, the new 2025 Lincoln Aviator SUV provides momentum beyond mere transportation. In this thoughtfully crafted and confidence-inspiring SUV, your destination is not about where you can go, but who you can be. Explore more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Aviator trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Fever, cough, congestion. When the symptoms keep coming, but you've got to keep going, you can rely on Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One. Just one dose of Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One relieves up to 9 cold and flu symptoms, helping you get on with your day. Need cold and flu relief? Get Mucinex Fast Max All-in-One and Done Relief. It's comeback season. Use as directed.
I want to talk about younger folks for a while, because they're not very, as a general rule, they're not very politically engaged. And I would guess, and I think your research backs this up, that they can be drawn into a more engaged role through religious institutions. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how congregations are sort of I assume they're trying to engage teens and young adults into sort of a broader civic participation.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite findings from our research, because a lot of places of worship are seeing this as a major problem right now, is that fewer and fewer young people are attending, are engaged. We have these aging populations. Between 2000 and 2020, the average age of people attending worship services went from 50 to 57. So our congregations are just getting older. But what we did in our survey is we asked about a variety of community issues. So everything from healthcare to crime to racial justice to foster care to criminal justice. And we said, how important is this issue to you? And if people said that the issue was very important, we asked a follow-up question and said, okay, is this a question that you want your congregation to be engaged in? Is this issue important enough that you think that your place of worship should be doing something about it? And there are some issues, right, like crime, that maybe people in Little Rock said, yeah, this is a really important issue, but it's not something that they see their place of worship getting engaged in helping to address. But some issues like racial justice, for instance, they said, yes, this is really important, and I want my congregation to do something about it. Now, if they said they want their congregation to be active on it, we asked another follow-up question, which was, would you personally be willing to volunteer on this issue? And almost across the board on almost every single issue, young people were more likely to say, yes, I would volunteer on this issue than older people. And this really kind of goes against conventional wisdom, which says that our volunteers are mostly drawn from older people. They're retired, they've got time, they're willing to contribute to their place of worship. But we really saw that it was the younger generation responding to our surveys who said, no, we want to participate. We just want to be given the opportunity. We're willing to volunteer. Any issue you can think of, if it's foster care, if it's health care, if it's racial justice, just give us the chance. We want to get out there and we want to get engaged. And there are some congregations who are trying to give young people those opportunities. The evangelical congregation who is engaging in their neighborhood around them in that particular zip code that they've adopted, that effort is being led by their 20-something group. So young people really are eager to get involved and engaged. They say again and again in our open-ended questions, in our focus groups, that they want more meaning in their worship services. They don't just want to come and listen to a sermon. They want to go out and actually do something.
And, one of the things I think historically that religious groups have done in terms of political engagement is getting involved in voter mobilization, voter registration efforts, that sort of thing. And that's a pretty common thing that you found, right? I wonder what sort of role, though, more specifically, you found that churches play in this, especially because nowadays even voter registration is a politically contentious thing, something we never would have probably considered, even a decade ago.
Right. And historically, places of worship they've been polling locations. They have played a big role in getting people out to vote. They have registered people at worship services. Black churches in particular have done Souls to the Polls, where they have driven people on early voting straight from church to early voting sites. And I agree that in recent years, this has become more and more controversial. We had our researchers out talking with people at early voting that was organized by 4 major large Black churches in Little Rock. And we heard from leaders and from people at those events that they really felt it was a moral obligation for the leaders to be out and talking to people about voting and for the members to be out and voting as well. And I think that young people can get really excited about that, especially if they see that efficacy, right? If they see that their voice matters and that they can really make a difference there. And I think that the leaders play a strong role in that. I think that especially as people hear about potential restrictions on voting and efforts to counter mobilize, I think that can be something that additionally leads them to be more engaged.
And do you feel, moving back from just the political type of engagement, because you talked about a lot of things that were not at all political earlier on, things like checking in on older folks and maybe providing meals and partnering up with schools, all that sort of stuff that's even in our current age, not really all that politically charged. And so I guess I'm wondering that, do you feel like this community engagement is sort of filling a gap or a hole where government is not active enough, or is it more than just a stopgap sort of thing?
Yeah, I do think that religious community engagement is valuable no matter where government is. I do think that there are places where there are significant community needs that congregations are filling. For instance, in Little Rock, and this is where Little Rock may be different from other communities, perhaps where there's stronger social support. But in Little Rock, the 3 top things that our congregations are doing, the number 1 community service that they're providing is marriage and family counseling. The number 2 thing that they're doing is giving rent and utility assistance. And that's because the poverty rate is so high. And the 3rd most common thing that they're doing is providing food support through food pantries or through providing direct food aid to people. So those are where the big needs are in the city of Little Rock. And so that can be seen, I think the marriage and family counseling can be seen as the religious priorities of the congregations, but the rent and utility assistance and the food aid is tied to the poverty of the area. And you could say that they're trying to fill a gap that perhaps government could be stepping in to do either at a local or a federal level. But I do think that community engagement is beneficial, no matter even if you were in a society that had a very robust social safety net and you didn't need those types of support from your congregations and from your religious institutions, because of the good that comes from community engagement for the members themselves. Because when the members are out and engaged in the community, they get those higher levels of efficacy and those feelings that they are contributing. So even if they didn't need to be providing those particular social services, if they were out helping and volunteering at the elementary school or picking up trash or building houses for Habitat for Humanity or attending community meetings or talking about community beautification or in some other way contributing to their own community, it's going to help them with those feelings of efficacy. And additionally, we also see like improved feelings of their own life satisfaction. And for the congregations and the community, the congregation leaders, we see them feeling closer to God. So those are all benefits to both the individuals and to the congregation that aggregate up to society as well.
Yeah, I think that ties into sort of a larger conservative point or religious conservative point that we've been making for a long time, that other things being equal, it's better for these sort of services to be provided by community groups because it's not just, people aren't just passive recipients of aid from this impersonal structure, but it's actually, the folks at St. Mark's or what have you, and it benefits both the giver and the recipient and builds a sense of community in a way that getting a check from the government or something like that just simply can't match. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that there is a benefit to having community relationships and to having that, but to giving. I think that whenever we give and serve, I think that there's good social science research on how that benefits just our psyches as humans, that it's good to give and to provide service. I don't think that that's necessarily a reason to not have a government social safety net or to necessarily have it only provided through religious networks. But I do think that no matter what the government social safety net is, that religious congregations should be engaged in providing service to their community. And I think that the data backs that up, that it's good for their members, it's good for their congregation, and it's good for democracy. No matter what government does, that can be one debate about the role of government, but the role of religion should be engagement in the community.
And of course, this is, I guess, even more challenging for a lot of religious groups because of the growth in a non-belief or non-affiliation by so many folks, especially younger folks. And so that's got to be really challenging for religious leaders who want to be engaged, but yet don't want to necessarily be off-putting to potential congregants, because there's that, I guess there would be sort of a tension of how do we get people in the door? We don't want to push them away by saying, oh, well, we're going to do this social justice sort of thing. And people say, can you just stop that sort of thing? And that's got to be pretty tough, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the cool findings of the study also is that it is good for congregations to be ideologically diverse. And it's hard for congregations to be ideologically diverse. It's hard for leaders to create an environment where both Democrats and Republicans feel comfortable worshiping together. But if they can do that, it's really good for their members. In fact, people feel more efficacy in a congregation with ideological diversity. They feel more warmth towards their congregation when there's more ideological diversity, and they're more likely to give service with ideological diversity. So leaders have to create an environment where it's not, we're going to go out to this super partisan rally or we're going to do this very political social justice. They need to create a place where everybody comes together to say, we are going to do this religiously motivated community engagement. And it's because of our deep religious convictions that we're going to go ahead and do this together, so that someone who's a Democrat and someone who's a Republican can together go out and feed the hungry. And when they're working next to each other side by side, they see each other as real people and instead of as ideological opponents. And that creates the warmth and the efficacy that's good for the congregation. And that's really good for democracy as well. And that's a tall order for leaders to create. But if they can do that, their congregation and our democracy will be so much better off.
Yeah, definitely. I wonder if, in a sense, the decline in church attendance might have something to do with churches actually not being engaged enough and not providing people with enough opportunities. I think of this from sort of an academic standpoint. As you know, one of the big things that, say, student affairs offices always say on college campuses is get the kids involved in activities, and they're going to be a lot more likely to stick around for the entire 4 years and get their degree. And I would assume the same sort of logic would apply for religious groups, but maybe I shouldn't assume that. But I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mike. So when people are giving service to their congregation, they're more likely to be attending. When they're connecting through participating in additional like small groups or like singing in the choir, things like that, they're more likely to attend more often. They're more likely to give. Those are just additional opportunities and points of connection. So I think you see the same thing in higher education. Sometimes they call it touch points, additional touch points where students are connected to the institution. The more often you can help your members of a congregation get connected to the institution, the more likely they're going to keep attending, they're going to give, they're going to feel that sense of warmth and engagement. And a great way to do that is engaging them in service out in the community, because those are the times when they both get to connect with the other members and build that camaraderie and warmth. And they get what their religious leaders would say is, the religious benefits of the blessings of service, right? That it's more blessed to give than to receive, that when you're out there serving and helping your community, that you're getting those blessings returned back to you in those warm, fuzzy feelings.
In your research, did you notice any sort of significant effect regarding the, I guess, more generalized decline in or trust for institutions of all sorts? And I'm kind of wondering how that maybe has changed the landscape for religious groups who are trying to become engaged and get new members and be a force in the community in an environment in which almost all large organizations are looked at more and more skeptically by a large number of Americans.
That's a good question. We didn't specifically ask trust questions about broader institutions, but I do think that especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, you saw people disengaging more from broader society and trusting less in all kinds of things, including in places of worship. And we definitely saw in our own community fewer people coming back to their places of worship after COVID-19, and fewer people kind of being willing to give their time and to give their trust. So I think there might be some broader trends there.
But I guess I also, on the other hand, then I wonder if religious organizations or congregations specifically are different. I think I'm sort of nominally Catholic, and I think about so many of other Catholics who have a huge problem with the crazy liberal Pope, but yet their congregation, they're good with their, with St. Anne's or something like that. And so I wonder if maybe that's sort of a reservoir of trust that people still have in those smallish kind of congregations as opposed to large impersonal institutions like a denomination or something like that. Well, what do you think?
We did ask people about how they felt about their congregation leader, and we did give some open-ended space. And what we found was that people really, really like their own congregation leader, which makes a lot of sense, because if you don't really like your congregation leader, mostly you leave and attend a different congregation. But people have a lot of trust for the leader of their own congregation, which I think is something that both is good for congregation leaders to hear and also puts a lot of weight on them, because they have a lot of responsibility, I would say, to help engage their congregation in the community and to help frame for them the actions that they take in a way that will help unify the congregation instead of creating these political divisions. They need to frame those issues in religious ways instead of in political ways. It really gives them a lot of power, how much trust their members have in them.
Whenever I've embarked on any sort of a research project, there's almost always been a point at which I found myself going, wow, I sure didn't expect that. And I'm wondering if you had any of those moments when you kind of sorted through all the findings and crunched all the numbers. Was there anything that jumped out to you as being like one of those, I wouldn't have seen that coming sort of moments?
I think I was really surprised with how much the leaders kind of already knew that what they needed to be doing was having more engagement, even though they weren't always doing it. So For instance, we had a congregation leader who said to us, we have better church when we're doing this particular type of engagement. When we have this going on, we have better church. They said, I believe it is a divine law that our church works better when we're doing this. But yet they didn't always have that community engaged activity going on. And I felt like pushing on that, like, why aren't you doing this all the time? And I think that it is a lot. It asks a lot. And congregations and their leaders are often pulled in many different directions. And to us, they sometimes said things like, how can we be expected to do community engagement when we're trying to keep the lights on, visit our members in the hospital, plan my Sunday sermon? How can I do all of these things and also lead a big community engagement effort? It's just too much. If I ask my members to go and do this engagement in the community, if I ask them to show up and do this big neighborhood cleanup, I'm not going to have enough volunteers when it's time to do our neighborhood Easter egg hunt. But what we actually found is that that's not the case, that community service and congregational service is self-reinforcing, that the more you engage in the community, the more your members actually give service to your congregation. It creates a culture of service that is self-reinforcing. And that's a big message that we want to get out to the congregations, that it's not a zero-sum game between community and congregational service, because so many of them seemed to want to be engaged in the community and to know that that's good for their membership, but to feel like they don't have enough resources to do it. And the data actually shows that when you do it, your resources multiply. Your members actually want to be further engaged in the congregation itself, and it creates a culture of service that leads to more and more service within the congregation and within the community.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, because I always tell students that the best way to get someone to help you out isn't to do something for them, but to ask them to do something for you. And then all of a sudden they have a stake in you, whether it's you or your organization. Sounds like it works in that level in churches and congregations as well. And so I'm wondering, I don't know how well, say, seminary would necessarily prepare religious leaders for, say, a quasi-community organizer type of role. And so maybe in part it's that some of these leaders of congregations don't necessarily have the temperament, the skill set necessarily to lead their congregations in that sort of way. They could maybe do a better job, say, religiously than in terms of going out in the community. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think more and more seminaries recently have added some of those skills, but I think you're totally right that a lot of congregation leaders feel unprepared for that. And I would encourage them to connect with nonprofits in the community, because one of the things that we found, and we did a big nonprofit survey in 2019, is that congregations and nonprofits are oftentimes working kind of in parallel in the community. You'll have congregations that are running a clothes closet, and you'll have nonprofits that are doing the same thing. You'll have congregations that are providing food, and you'll have nonprofits that are doing the same thing. You'll have congregations that are helping people with addiction recovery and nonprofits that are doing the same thing. But so often they don't connect and work with each other. So if you are a congregation leader who wants to do some good, the first thing that you should do is look for a nonprofit that's already doing those things and see how you can work with them, because they are definitely trained as community service advocates and community organizers, and you can tap right into those resources.
I feel like it's asking an awful lot of a lot of these religious leaders. I mean, outside of, say, really well-resourced megachurch sort of things, for your typical congregation, it just seems to me that a lot of the folks leading them just don't necessarily have a whole lot of time, even if they have the inclination. And I got to imagine that burnout as it is has got to be awfully high. And then when you say, well, you got to engage people more, and they say, well, how exactly do I do that? And so it's just got to be so frustrating, I imagine, in some instances for these religious leaders who want to do more, but just feel like, I'm guessing that they just don't have the resources or the stamina personally to do all this stuff.
Absolutely. Congregation leaders are some of the busiest people in the world.
Yeah.
And as someone who has somehow wrangled hundreds of them into interviews over the last 10 years, I can tell you they are difficult to get a hold of, and they're very, very busy. I think one of the key assets that clergy have is their members, especially their young members, because as we've talked about, those are the people who want to get involved. And so those members, if they are thinking to themselves, well, I already know about this issue in the community that I really care about, or I'm connected with this nonprofit through my cousin or my brother or my neighbor, if they bring that to their congregation leader and say, this is how I want to get our congregation involved, their leader will be so excited that somebody else is willing to do it, somebody else has the idea, and that they'll do some of the effort of organizing it. They'll say, absolutely, let's make it happen. And really what the congregation leader's key role is to get people on the same page by framing it as a religious issue that everybody can get behind and not a partisan issue. And then you can get the people to do the actual organizing, send out the sign-up sheet, decide what time we're all going to meet, make sure that there are snacks and rides and all of that kind of stuff so that the congregation leader doesn't have to do that minutia, but they do the big picture framing and mobilizing.
Kind of pulling back and taking sort of a bigger picture view, do you feel like religious organizations are less important in engagement, especially political engagement, than they used to be in the past? And if we kind of look forward, do you see the U.S. moving into more of kind of a Western European model where religion is almost, it seems like an afterthought politically? Or do you think that religious organizations can and will play a stronger role in the future? I guess sort of what's your general kind of midterm outlook on this?
Yeah. So the U.S. has always kind of been an outlier when it comes to Western democracies and developed countries and religion. The U.S. has always been more religious than Western Europe, for instance. And we have seen decline of religiosity. There are more people who are identifying as religious nuns, saying that they don't have a religious affiliation. And we do see a decline in attendance. But I think we're a long ways away from religion not mattering for American politics. I think because of the issues that you've pointed out before, the culture war issues, I think abortion is a huge issue in the United States right now. And so many people are galvanized around it because of religion. I think that because of these issues and because so many people in the United States continue to identify with religion, it is incredibly important for those issues, which feel a little bit partisan. But I also think religion is important for democracy. Congregations are really important places where people can learn civic skills from like a 10,000 foot level of political science here. When people attend congregations, they learn in small groups about setting an agenda, about organizing people, right? Putting out those sign-up sheets and getting people together for a community event or to work together on service. They can come into contact with people that they don't necessarily agree with ideologically, and yet they can work together. And all of those things create efficacy and also help them develop civic skills that they can use to participate in democracy more effectively. And all of those things are really good for democracy. It's sometimes hard to get there, but congregations really do contribute to the broader fabric of democracy in a really meaningful way. When we just identify issues like abortion and transgender rights, it feels like religion might be pulling apart the threads of democracy. But when we look at how it contributes to efficacy and civic skills, it really is helping to build up democracy.
Yeah, like I've said, there's all kinds of interesting insights and findings in the book. And so I would encourage folks to check it out. I thought I knew a fair amount about religious groups and engagement, and it turns out I didn't know nearly as much as I thought. It was a very rewarding experience. And so I'm just so glad we had an opportunity to talk about the book. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Mike. It was my joy.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you're not already a supporter of the show, I hope you'll consider becoming one, because without our supporters, we wouldn't be able to do this. And when you become a supporter, you get not just that warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're supporting a good cause. I like to think we're a good cause, but you also get stuff like ad-free versions of everything we put out. You get our supporter exclusive midweek show, the full length of that, not just the preview. And you also get to be part of our Discord group if you want. And there's always some interesting conversations going on there. At the $10 a month level or more, you get to actually be part of the episodes Jay and I do, if that's something you're interested in. So there's a lot of stuff is what I am saying. And I hope you'll consider checking it out. And to do that, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. If you want to support us on Venmo, we're at politicsguys. You can also support the show through PayPal. And all of our support links are always in the show notes, as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And as always, I want to close with a very special thank you to our wonderful executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,